those two would be commodities. And when I talked to them about the bill, we went over everything. It struck me because the aide said to me, I said, "What about this? Like with Bitcoin and Ether, like shouldn't it maybe just be Bitcoin, or what's the deal with this?" And they said, "Well, actually, we got feedback from the SEC on this bill, and we were surprised because the SEC had a problem with us saying Bitcoin and Ether are both digital commodities forever and ever, because that was because." Exactly what you just said, Joe, because literally they said the SEC said to them they want to keep their options open. And I said, even for Bitcoin, they're like, yeah, they want to keep their options open. So I think there's validity to that concept of, as a regulator, wanting to keep your options open. Josh, okay, look, I'm very fortunate. We have Huddle on stage. I got John in the audience, people from the old
preeminent lawyer at American Huddle has joined.
That's right, American Huddle lawyer. So Josh, I'm going to ask you a kind of an indirect or direct question about Ripple. Like, two things. One, did Ripple lose in court? And number two, did kind of Brad Garlinghouse and get excused from that case more as a strategic way of the SEC being able to continue their strategy in court by just settling those charges or throwing that out because they're more interested in trying to get a favorable opinion about whether XRP is a security or not?
So thank you for that question. So I think whether Ripple lost or won in that case, I think is a matter of perspective. Like certainly each side prevailed at summary judgment on certain of the issues. I think the SEC would view the Ripple case probably as a win for it in some respects, certainly as a loss for it in others. And I think similarly, while I think it is a win for the industry in general that that Judge Torres in that case did find that programmatic sales on platform, even primary programmatic sales, she didn't explicitly address secondary sales in that opinion. I think that's a win insofar as a dent or a hole in the SEC's armor. I think the fact that each of them won summary judgment on different components shows that it was both a win and a loss. I do think, although I hesitate to say this because I'm not close enough to the facts nor to the people involved, but it does seem to be, or okay, how can I put this? It seems plausible that it may have been a strategic step by the SEC to avoid the potential for, frankly, another loss, or also to, as you noted, get to a favorable decision sooner, as you put it. I mean, I do think, and this goes back to what was said by the other speakers about the splits even within the district. So obviously, Judge Torres's decision was expressly, or reasoning was expressly not accepted or rejected by Judge Rakoff, granted in a totally different case at a totally different procedural posture, right? A totally different stage in the case, and a different standard for which the decisions might be made. But that when the SEC did try to bring an interlocutory appeal, saying like, look, we do have this split, and actually this split within the Southern District is relevant to other cases that are before judges right now. Obviously the SEC did not prevail on the ability to have an interlocutory appeal. So they would have had to have gone through the entire remaining portions of the case, including the actions against the principals. So yeah, I mean, I think it depends on which way you look at it, but I think overall, people generally would tend to say that Ripple was a victory for the industry and not for the SEC. I think importantly for some of the cases involving platforms, my recollection is that when asked to clarify certain allegations, I believe it had to do with the Coinbase complaint. The SEC had submitted a letter, I don't have it handy, but where they basically said, oh, no, we were talking about primary sales on the platform, right? Not secondary sales. And so I think the language of Judge Torres's decision as to primary programmatic sales, I think is very important strategically for the industry in connection with the cases, certainly against Coinbase, but also potentially against the other trading platforms.
So I asked that question strategically, and we just lost Zach. So Zach, thank you. I don't know if you had to go, but Joe, I'd love your response to this, and then Josh too. Okay, so what I'm getting at is, look, Brad Garlinghouse, yeah, he's excused, but in terms of messages we're sending to people in the industry, like Brad Garlinghouse, there's evidence, you can go back and watch it, where he would go on CNBC and talk about how great XRP was, and then and then he'd be selling his own XRP once the price rose, right? That's sort of the gist of it. I'm not saying he did that, he didn't that, but go back and watch it on CNBC, okay? It could be anybody. It doesn't have to be Brad Garlinghouse. It can be anybody. But the message seems to be, if you're leading a token, if I'm Jason Brett and I launch Clown Token and I go on CNBC telling everybody how great Clown Token is, and then once I get off air, I go and sell all my Clown Token on the bump up in the price, that's not really a good message to be sending to people that that's okay. So by the SEC sort of just throwing that case out, to me, that's a bit of a message of, if you're running a token project versus an exchange, where is that line? Like, could I go do that today? But it seems like I probably couldn't, right? Because now we're seeing CZ and Sam Bankman-Fried both both facing jail time. SBF definitely facing a long jail sentence. CZ maybe not. The message seems to be if you're running an exchange, it's the people who are running these centralized exchanges that are primarily responsible for everything. And I think that's the shift that Zach was talking about, where the focus of the SEC isn't on the developer, it's on the centralized exchange. So I asked that question, Josh, because I did want to raise like the prospect of like, what does this say to you if you have a crypto project today or you're trying to launch a token? I mean, does all this also clear the waters and just say, yes, like Bitcoin is now safe? And so, what the developers, the people out there in the ecosystem need to think about, and at the same time, the messages that both the SEC and the government are sending to both the CEOs of any crypto exchange out there, whether you're onshore or offshore, and any leaders like a Brad Garlinghouse or anybody that's running a token. Josh?
Oh, sorry, Jason. I didn't realize you were directing that to me. So I would say, in general, I think that the how can I best say this? The stance at which I'm generally advising projects and teams is typically at the earlier stages, or not necessarily the earlier stages, but it's, you know, the kind of advice that you might get as a regulatory matter for how you might try to steer clear of potential litigation down the road often may be different from the arguments that one may make um, once one already is in litigation. And what I mean by that is, like, certainly if you listen to, say, Gary Gensler or others making very strong statements about what their personal beliefs are about how digital assets should be treated and the likelihood that in their view they may be securities, that may be a very different position from what can actually be proven before a court. And I think as others on this Twitter spaces have made clear, um, you know, when you have a principles based law, there are not necessarily bright lines, right? And so the facts and circumstances matter. The facts and circumstances will be put before a court. So I don't know that actually these rulings necessarily change the advice from a regulatory perspective that one might give to a project. I mean, certainly, I would say if you'd like to stay out of the SEC's crosshairs, perhaps, you know, err on the side of being conservative, right? And perhaps not do the things that the SEC may cite later in an enforcement action in terms of you know trying what the SEC might characterize as trying to pump up the price or creating an expectation of profit, things like that. But that's very different from what we see in the emerging law that is being created by courts about what can be proven in court. So I do think those are two different types of analyses, and I would say that notwithstanding the outcomes of some of the cases that we are seeing, including Ripple, it doesn't necessarily change the advice that I would give to founders and teams at the outset.
Great. Joe, and then Josh and Joe as our wonderful attorneys up here. After Joe speaks, I'd like to now turn it to any questions that we have. I brought some people up, ask you some questions, and then we'll look to wrap up the space. Joe, to you, and then we'll take questions.
Yeah. So let's start from the standpoint of if you're counseling a client, you really, in my opinion, at this point, I think you have to be careful about giving any sort of firm position on any of this stuff because it will not be resolved anywhere in the near future. It's going to wind its way through the court system for years from now, absent some new legislation passed by Congress. So, if you take new legislation passed by Congress off the table, you should expect these cases to wind their way through the court system for, probably 5 to 10 years, to be quite honest. And I'll explain why. Because if you go to what was referenced earlier, the denial of the interlocutory appeal, even Judge Torres, who, obviously not a friend to the SEC in this case, she basically went out of her way in her denial of the appeal to say that her opinion with respect to Ripple Labs has no precedential value. She actually, and if anybody wants to read this, there's one paragraph where you, and I'll just share it with everybody. You can look for it yourself, and I'll post it on my Twitter. It's page 7 of her denial. She says, and I'm quoting from her denial of the interlocutory appeal. She says, in arguing that the order has precedential value, and she includes precedential value to apply, that's what the SEC is saying. In arguing that the order has precedential value for other digital asset cases, the SEC misconstrues the court's holding. So what she's basically saying is the SEC is saying that this matters for other cases. That's wrong. That's the judge saying that, not me. For example, the SEC seeks to appeal the question. She's quoting from the SEC's motion for interlocutory appeal. Can an issuer's offer and sales on a crypto asset trading platform create a reasonable expectation of profits on the efforts of others? Okay. So again, she's saying that's what the SEC thinks is a question that demands immediate appeal to the appellate court to look at this issue of, can you create an expectation of privacy for secondary market sales? And she says the court did not hold that. The court did not hold that offers and sales on digital asset exchanges cannot create a reasonable expectation of privacy based on the efforts of others. The court held that based on the totality of circumstances in this case, italicizing in this case, and in the judge's opinion, based on the facts, circumstances, and economic realities of the transactions, Ripple's programmatic sales did not lead investors to reasonably expect profits from others, from the efforts of others. So, just to break that down, what the judge is saying is, like, number one, don't use this as precedent. Number two, I'm not making any ruling, in general about whether secondary market sales can in fact be investment contracts. I don't need to go there. And number three, I've looked at what was present, what was in the record, what were the totality of facts and circumstances in this particular case, and that leads me to believe that the programmatic sales alone were not, in fact, investment contracts. So if the SEC wanted to go into any other courtroom in the United States, and they have an opponent saying secondary market sales, those can't be investment contracts, and they're citing SC versus Ripple, they can now hold up Judge Torres's denial of the motion for an interlocutory appeal and say, no, that's exactly what the judge said wasn't her holding. So anybody arguing that this resolves the issue of, exchange-based sales, secondary market sales, it absolutely does not. It applies in the limited context of what was going on in the Ripple Labs case. Now, the obvious question is, well, how could a secondary market sale? What fact pattern would you need for programmatic or secondary market sales, which is how the developers actually make money selling their tokens on exchanges? What argument would transform that into investment contract? And the answer is, we don't know. We don't know what the judge is thinking. I mean, clearly the judge has some indication of facts that she would like to see for that to exist. We can speculate, we can put forward tests, but when you're counseling clients, like, it's a dangerous area because you're basically just creating a hypothesis about what a judge may in fact find to be investment contracts in the context of a secondary market sale.
Great. Thank you, Joe. First of all, Joe and Josh, I know Zach had to drop, but thank you for taking time, particularly right before Thanksgiving. We're all in sort of the mode toward going into Thanksgiving, but I'm sure there'll be like 500 other panels about all of what we've seen happen this week with Kraken and Binance. So